tonight's event, we're really excited to be joined by Anthony Barnett and Marcus Gilroy-Ware to discuss Anthony's most recent book, Taking Control. Anthony is the author of Iron Britannia, Soviet Freedom, This Time, and The Lure of Greatness. He was the first coordinator of Britain's Charter 88, co-director of the Convention on Modern Liberty, and was the founding editor of openDemocracy from 2001 to 2007. And we're really grateful that he's here with us this evening.
Very pleased to be here.
He is going to be in conversation with Marcus Gilroy-Ware, who is the author of Filling the Void, Emotion, Social Media and Capitalism, and more recently, After the Fact, The Truth About Fake News. He is a writer, teacher, researcher, and creator, and a really brilliant person to be asking the questions for tonight. I will be posting links to both Anthony and Marcus's books in the chat if you would like to order them from Housemans if you don't have them already. And if you've got any questions or comments through tonight's event, you can share them with the speakers and the rest of the audience in the chat. We will be keeping an eye on that and keeping everything running smoothly, but I'm going to now step aside and let our speakers take charge. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us and hope you enjoy the event.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I would like to dive straight in. So I want to thank Anthony for asking me to do this, and it's a real honor to do this at Housemans as well. We've got quite a lot to get through. We were just saying before this started that these kinds of interconnected sets of topics and ideas are something about which there's kind of always more to say. Anthony, as a way of starting, I thought I could ask you maybe just what it was you kind of wanted to achieve with this book and what it was that drove you to write it. The book is awesome. Again, it's called Taking Control, and everyone should buy it from Housemans.
Right, thank you, Marcus. Well, it's very nice to be here, and it's very, very nice. This is a radical book, and that's a very good word. And it's very nice to be able to sort of talk about it thanks to a radical, historic radical bookshop. And what led to my writing the book, I was writing a different book when the events of the US election took place. And that meant that at the beginning of last year, at the beginning of 2020, I felt I had to drop the book. I described this in the introduction. The book was about the way in which the book I was writing, the way in which the left had tried again and again, especially over the last 20 years when I've been editing and involved with openDemocracy, to break through, to impinge, to shift the nature of politics in the West in particular, and have been pushed back by, if you like, a kind of dual party consensus built around neoliberalism, around the way in which both the parties of the left and parties of the working class, the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, and the parties of the Conservatives were both pushing an agenda, a radical agenda of marketization, which was, one of its most profound functions was to deny any democratic effectiveness to the popular feelings and demands. And when there were popular policies, they were always done, and Labour Party is a very good example of this, in a way which disarmed the, if you like, the kind of popular engagement. They were built upon fatalism. And what happened in the United States in that extraordinary period was that what we saw, unlike Britain, which we can come to, was a way in which the two parties started to represent profoundly different directions. There was a division within the traditional hegemony, bipartisan hegemony that we had experienced for so long. And the Trumpism, especially after the assault upon the Capitol and the degree of support for it, which is the most important factor, which is what surprised me, of the Republican Party, was taking the main party of the right in the United States into a fascist, neo-fascist, white supremacist direction. And on the other hand, Biden, when he started to legislate, was openly acknowledging and thanking Bernie Sanders for supporting a transformative agenda and inspiring people to vote. So there was a conscious, however deep it was, alliance between the traditional Democratic Party and a populist, active, progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is now becoming enormously strong and influential. And this is something completely new in my lifetime. And I thought, okay, I can no longer write a book about how the left has been frustrated and locked out of power. Something is shifting. And that had to be addressed. What is the nature of this shift? What are the reasons for it? And how do we on the left and within the left of the liberal center take advantage of it? How do we build a democratic politics out of this moment? And paradoxically, another surprise in a way is that it was the United States which is in the lead in terms of this argument rather than any European country.
Thank you. That's actually a really helpful introduction, I think, especially for people who are kind of not familiar with the book. Certainly, I think they'll be very familiar with those kinds of with those issues. I mean, there's just so much that we could say here, and you know, I think I'm amongst the many people who are extremely kind of frustrated with the first thing you were saying, you were writing about. You know, this kind of sense that we have been kind of either kind of given soft versions of the policies we're asking for that don't really achieve the thing they're meant to, or just kind of stonewalled, and that not only, I guess you could say even from the end of the Cold War, not only was the kind of Soviet Union kind of, you know, that sort of thing was shut down, but also the actual social democratic movements at that point were shut down, and basically neoliberal capitalism takes over. And there's a kind of this kind of enormous frustration that built up over that kind of approximately 30 to 40 year period.
Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism comes in, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm rightly criticized for reaching for Mark Fisher too often, but actually, I think, you know, he really did put his finger on it. And this sort of, you know, again, we now sort of roll our eyes when we talk about the end of history, because we know that history has kind of restarted, as it were. And I think that's a lot of what I can see you writing about. So I wanted to kind of just dive into a few things here. I mean, there's just kind of so much to talk about, but I guess to start us off, as far as kind of understanding Trumpism a bit more as one of the responses to that kind of stuff, because there's a lot of things in that reactionary base that Trump kind of calls home, and his ongoing movement calls home. Can you talk us through a little bit, kind of what the different elements of that Trump base are, and how each is responding in its own way to?
Yes, so there is a peculiar. It's quite interesting because the American. It's true that one of the reasons why this, if you like, potentially progressive polarization is taking place in America rather than, or doing so more clearly than here, is that race and plays a much deeper role in the American politics, as we're now seen in effect with the Supreme Court decision, or the draft Supreme Court decision yesterday, which is all about states' rights and goes back to the Civil War. And so Trump drew upon a quite complex set of frustrations. I think one of the deep drivers of this was a sense that the American population is becoming multiracial, and that the white Christians, especially older, I mean, so 60% of white men voted for Trump. That still means a lot of white men didn't. That's a very significant majority. And white America voted for Trump, and old America voted for Trump. So he tapped into those forces, but they also were underlined by evangelicalism and which then fed a lot of that religious right, has driven the hostility to abortion and to Roe versus Wade, that decision. And there was also another element which Trump responded to, which is the historic military failure of the United States, as well as the financial failure. So, in 2016, when he was running for the nomination, the Republican Party nomination, the lead candidate that everybody thought would get the nomination was another son of Bush, and he destroyed him at a primary hustings by simply denouncing the Iraq War as a big fat mistake, wasting trillions of dollars. He ran against the war, and he ran as, so to speak, a pro-working class candidate who understood how the system was rigged and he could fix it. So he ran in a certain way from the left, and Hillary Clinton was completely disarmed by the way he did that. But it meant that he tapped into a very profound set of economic, cultural, and military frustrations of very large sections of the American population. But I think I would add is that he would have won the 2020 election. I think it's really important to understand this is how dangerous the situation is.
I definitely thought he was going to win.
Without COVID. COVID that triggered the businessman who had to run things suddenly actually had to, act with intelligent government, and he completely failed to do so. And I think that COVID was the element which tipped him into being, he was incapable of actually being president when that was needed. And
that's the reason why we have to take it so seriously, right? Is that without the pandemic, the political side that was driving that was actually kind of alive and well. Right?
Oh yes, I think
there's so much to this
Trump
that's still got to be hard.
The point is, Trump can return in 2024, and the danger, the nature of the danger is that if something I read about, if Brazil was under Lula, and if if China was a sort of socialist country, and if India was a genuine multiracial democracy, and if South Africa was in fact living up to its constitution, it would be a different situation. But if were Trump to return in 2024, it would be click for authoritarians around the entire globe. And in the American, it's no longer the case that the United States determines the fate of the world in the way that it did, but it is the case that in the world that we now live in, if the United States were to move to lock back into an authoritarian Trumpite settlement, we would space 20 to 30 years of neo-fascism. And I think that's what we're up against. And that's one of the, but when I say that, what's very important is that there are a lot of people within the liberal center who were historically opponents of progressives, who are being faced with the choice of Trumpism or having an alliance, if I could put it, with us. And this represents a positive political opportunity. We may lose, and I think in Britain, there's a deep sense of fatalism after post-Corbyn, that there's nothing we can do about it. But this is not the situation in America. And I've done this film, I've interviewed various significant senior leading Congress people, both in Congress and activists outside it. And there is a real fight on there. So and what is the nature of that, and how should that be supported and developed, is the core, both the motive behind the book and what I try to examine.
Yeah, I mean, it's as you say, it's all to play for. It's such a kind of interesting challenge, because there's definitely a case to be made that this can be beaten back, it can be defeated, but there's also, it's inevitable that this is still remains a huge danger.
Right.
And it kind of keeps that power partly by appealing to so many different bases at once, as you point out. And I think there's something really interesting about the way that it communicates simultaneously, because it's a kind of, as you say in your book, and I say in mine as well, there's a confluence of many different elements that make up Trumpism. That's what gives it its kind of its power, and actually how we even make sense of that is something that's subject to a lot of misunderstanding, right? Which is what I think we're trying to clear up.
You're looking at the way, which I also recommend that everybody should read, but the way in which our sense of what is true and false has been manipulated. But one of the striking things about Trump is that he did appear to be true to the experience of what it was like to be American. For a lot of people, a lot of people thought it was absolutely horrific that he could represent the truth of what it was like to be an American. So that's where if you like, the Civil War is still continuing in that in that form. But if I could just say this about Trumpism and how I say we should learn from it, but what its significance for politics as a whole is that we talked earlier about the way in which the neoliberal, the marketization settlement after the end of the Cold War squashed people. And it did two things. It encouraged a consumer mentality of our individual creativity and demand and the market, etc., and made us responsible for our fate. And on the other hand, it told us that we were powerless when it came to doing anything socially or politically, that the market knew best and there was no alternative. And it disarmed us politically. And my argument in the book is that neoliberalism should not be seen as an economic theory. It should be seen as a politics. It always actually demanded the role of the state, but the role of the state was to disarm us and to tell us that politically we were powerless. And it was Trump that broke fatalism. It was Trump that made voting count. It wasn't the Clintons or the Labour, etc. And that is paradoxically a valuable inheritance, because now the traditional centrist parties face a choice. Can they push us back into the box of fatalism? And if they can't, then what do they do? Because how do they retain any shape or shaping influence on the situation, given that Trump has actually delegitimized the way in which they governed and has got millions and millions of people behind him? And so I think that's where we represent the democratic alternative, we progressives in the larger sense, the only democratic alternative within our pluralism, within our own multitude, to Trumpism and fascism.
Just, this isn't amongst the things we've planned, but I wanted to ask you then, kind of jumping off of this, what do you make of the kind of language of populism that almost kind of sets up a kind of equivalence, I think a false equivalence between left and right in terms of you've got politicians like Trump and Le Pen and so forth on the right who kind of are trying to reawaken people's kind of anger and emotion in order to get them voting. I mean, they're often called anti-democratic movements, but as you say, they're actually, reawakening a lot of that stuff. And then you have kind of, movements like, Corbynism didn't really, in the end, work out that well. Same, Bernie Sanders has kind of been consigned sort of to the side as well. The language of populism to talk about all of this, do you think that that's kind of a helpful
I think it's very good, but I think underneath populism is the idea that there is a monolithic identity. And I don't believe there is a monolithic identity. So what the populists are doing is to try and force us into thinking that there is only one way to be American or one way to be British. Brexit is partly about that. And I think that the democratic energy that we need is one which says, no, actually there are different ways of being, our identities are multiple, and that we should reject the notion that there is a people with a value which defines what a country is, that our country, all of our countries are in fact, have many possibilities and potentialities. And I think what's striking is, I think the Corbynism, and there's a big difference, Corbynism in a certain way, I mean, it failed for particular reasons, but it was also was both a pre-shock and was destroyed by the whole Brexit process. Bernie Sanders is different. And one of the things that's happening, and one of the things that you could see, and I think you've written about this, the way the media is trying to force us into seeing the left as demagogic extremists, as the equivalent of a kind of Farage. And that's what they're trying to do. Whereas actually, when you go to the United States, there are over 90, nearly 100 members of the US Progressive Caucus in Congress. And they have quite wide-ranging views, and they're arguing for the more articulate, a progressive capitalism, which is not the language of Bernie Sanders. And they're much more complex, and they're quite rich and different and diverse. They're diverse racially, and they're diverse politically, and they're also activating the trade union movement now. But Bernie Sanders is particularly good on that. So and that's what we're about. And I think that it's important that when you say we're Democrats, that means that we are inherently pluralistic in our approach, and that we're not seeking an alternative, monolithic, popular us.
No, and yet the way that that's communicated, I mean, this kind of feeds nicely into our next question in a way. I feel that there's something really mendacious about the way that this kind of these ideas about who is, I mean, it's identity politics in the sense that it's a question really, or it gets made into a question about who you are, and therefore who's going to speak for that as you call it, monolithic identity that you are. And actually, I think that that's an incredibly, we know that Trump is mendacious. We know that there's a lot of lying that happens, and a lot of very careful redirection of people's attentions and their emotions in order to kind of get them all funneled into these kinds of movements, really. And I think that's something that you see not only with Trump, but with a number of the other kind of reactionary right movements across. I mean, it's very much part of the Erdogan movement and other things as well. So I think there's kind of a question about coherence there, the like kind of coherence and deceit that I wanted to kind of ask you, of jumping off here, because, even the way we talk about these things, the way that Democrats actually understand the problem of what Trump represents, but also the way that people within Trump's base understand what he represents, is very kind of smoke and mirrors. And, obviously there's the myth that like Trump speaks for the working class and speaks to the working class. And we know that the data don't back that up. As you say in your book, there's this kind of squeezed middle of 60%. And as you said earlier, there's the religious community, even though Trump does not.
And the rich support Trump. Trump
absolutely
was the candidate of the rich, and he immediately gave them tax benefits. And
that was showing his real colors, right?
Because of through the American pension system, they're invested in the stock exchange. So that Trump was definitely the candidate of the rich.
Yeah, this is an elite project, and a bit like how Brexit actually kind of really is an elite project if you kind of dig down into it. And yet for it to be sold to a kind of nominally majoritarian democratic functioning, system, it has to convince lots of other people that it's kind of going to do something for them as well, or for their values, or for who they are. But that's a lie, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I think, so the problem about Brexit, which, and I think this is for me, there's a great sadness here about it, is that Brexit came from a deep and profound failure of the English to accept their English. And it was a vote, 11% of what this country, which I call England without London, but voted by 11%. It didn't vote for Brexit because of lies, it voted for Brexit because it was profoundly frustrated, and it felt powerless. Unlike in Scotland, unlike mostly in Wales, unlike in Northern Ireland, there were no representative institutions that it believed in. It ceased to believe in Westminster, and it projected, and it was encouraged to project its feelings of rage and frustration with the way it was governed onto Brussels. And therefore it was a democratic impulse of the very destructive one. And I think that it doesn't really help to simply see this as a form of deceit in the simple sense.
No.
Well, that's a lie, and we know the truth. And the problem, I can put it this way, if you say to most Remainers, those that I Remainers, if you like myself or my friends, family, etc., and you say, look, we got this wrong. Look, the way England, we have a responsibility. After all, the Remainers governed the United Kingdom for decades. They are responsible for this outcome. And there's a complete no, it was lies. It was tricked. The people was tricked. It was all technical somehow or other. And there's a refusal, a quite profound refusal, I think, to face up to the fact that Britain is over. Great Britain is over, and Brexit represented a rage of people that have been misled. So there's within these big political issues, there's a question, a profound question of what kind of country we are, of a national story, which can't really be defined by saying this is true or this is a lie. So within what's taking place in the United States, there is a very large numbers of Americans who think that America exists in order for that it's a white Christian country. That is the national story. And if giving everybody the equal right to vote means it ceases to be a white Christian country, then
they don't want to do it.
Right to vote. And therefore, very large numbers, I think over 60% of Republicans do not feel that the right to vote is something which is intrinsic to their democracy. They think that there should be certified, that there should be processes that, so it's not, they won't think of themselves as racist in the simple sense of the word, but they're willing to accept the company of blacks and brown people on their terms. But they still want America to remain a white Christian country. And there's another lot of Americans that are saying, no, actually, we are a democratic country and we're a multiracial country. And that's what is important and good about the United States. And that's a very profound difference. And I don't think you get to that difference by saying this side is lying and that side. I know we manipulate within it, but they underneath it, they understand that this is a story of what it's about. And the problem with Brexit here, which isn't what I write about in the book. I have written a book about Brexit, and I don't, you can't, Brexit is a car crash, and we're being represented by, the two party leaders. One of them represents Brexit in its most profound and obvious sense and is completely corrupt, namely the Prime Minister. And the leader of the opposition says we're going to make Brexit work. Well, you can't make a car crash work. I mean, it's just not, it's a dishonest attempt to say, well, I'm not going to offer an alternative story of what it means to be English and to be Scottish. I'm talking Scotland at the moment, or Wales, Welsh or Irish. And that refusal by the opposition to challenge the core narrative, if you want to call it that, that is being offered to the country by the Conservative Party means that we're in for another 5 to 10 years of disastrous politics. So people here feel, I was doing one read where I was almost accused of being optimistic because I think there's all to fight for, and almost a reluctance to believe that in the United States, the forces that are at work, they can see what they're up against, but the forces that are opposing it are immense and vital and powerful. So if you just take, sorry, I'm going to rattle on, but the decision, the Supreme Court decision, 58% of the American population are in favor of Roe versus Wade remaining of the right to abortion, and 27% oppose it. So it's a 2-to-1, and 18 to 19% have no opinion. So the Supreme Court has become ceasing to be a judicial court. It's becoming a political court.
Yes, it's policy.
But it's also running itself right against a democratic opinion. And that is a fight that we can win. I say we, because I think that fight, it will imply a larger sense of the future of the United States. And as I say, America is now the hinge country for how the world will shape up.
I mean, obviously, we can come back to the judiciary and Supreme Court, but clearly, I mean, this is a kind of exaggeration of a problem that's been brewing for a while, where I think the reason why they even fight about presidents being able to kind of, nominate new Supreme Court justices is precisely because everybody kind of knows that the US judiciary, for the most part, with a few little exceptions that you could point to, do have a bias, do have a stance. I mean, I think you mentioned in your book that, in terms of certifying the election results, there was even something of a surprise that actually Republican judges decided to not back the kind of claims of fraud, even though it would have kind of, strictly speaking, been in their column, supported their party. But just to kind of clarify, I wasn't speaking in a strict sense of deceit. I agree with you, that's a very simplistic thing, but more that maybe there's a reconditioning of political discourse in a way that means that there are certain kinds of things that kind of can prevail over a sense, of actually being motivated to find out what really it has happened or who really is corrupt or isn't. In the sense that who you think you follow, who you think speaks to who you really are, who kind of speaks to the frustrations that you have. These things end up being more important than the motivations you might have around kind of caring what's true or what isn't, and therefore that you become kind of almost guidable in that sense, that you can be led, or kind of tricked into supporting things because you are angry, and some of those angers are legitimate. And in fact, Democrats quite often don't really want to address the legitimacy.
No, they certainly don't. Yes, I mean, there is one of the so the number of things which this raises. I agree, this is an absolutely central issue for us. One of the issues it raises, and which is still quite a profound problem in the United States, is that Democrats and the left here are arrogant and dismissive of the poorly articulated and sometimes racially articulated objections to the suffering that many of their compatriots feel and are reaching for. And that contempt, the classic example is Hillary Clinton calling the working class who were not voting Democrat sort of deplorables, because they carried guns and because they were rednecks. That led to her defeat, but it's very difficult to reach out to and to listen to somebody whose underlying agenda you feel is white supremacist. Nonetheless, there's got to be a sense in which saying, well, what are they? There has to be a way in which their concerns are capable of being articulated and developed and recognized within any political outcome. And I think this is one of the problems which I talk about a bit in terms of what should a future politics look like, because I don't think we're there yet, is the development of forms of direct participation, of citizens' assemblies, of forms of deliberative democracy, where everybody feels that, well, I may not like the outcome, but my voice will be heard and will be registered. And I put it this way, the whole system of representative democracy that we have inherited was designed to keep the unwashed at bay, at arm's length. So it was designed to ensure there was a rule of law, which is one of the big challenges that Trump has made against that. It was designed to ensure the rule of law. It was designed to ensure a peaceful change of government, which is very important if you want to secure a regime against Bonapartism, against dictatorships, in terms of the ruling elite. And it was designed to organize consent. So that people did feel, it's true that, many women before they had the vote in the United Kingdom at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, definitely still consented to the way they were governed. It was designed as a way of saying, here we have our parliament, we have a legislative process, and this does in a way It organized itself, but it was also designed to make sure that people, that public anger and the threat that might represent to property was absolutely kept under the hammer. So people, when they don't trust representative institutions of representative democracy, it's partly because the institutions of representative democracy intrinsically were built on the distrust of popular power. Yeah. And now we have a situation where we're far more educated, where we have smartphones, so to speak, where we're working in the digital space, where we're capable of forms of participation and want our voices to be heard and recognized. And we need, and this is not something about America or Britain, there is a crisis of representative democracy across the system. And so one of the most interesting examples of whether anything can be done about this is taking place in Chile, where it was the first country to fall under the full impact of marketization and monetization with Pinochet, when the Chicago Boys organized, the Chicago Boys were sent in after the CIA, after Kissinger and Nixon ordered the coup and the overthrow of Allende, who was representing a democratic socialist alternative. And now it looks as if there has been a constitutional convention elected separately from the parliament with the aim of developing a constitution for the people, which is now included environmental requirements into the deep constitution of Chile. And that suggests points towards a forms of democracy where if you like, you can disarm the extremism, the way in which extremism speaks to many sections of the population by saying, no, actually, we're now building a democracy in which your voice is going to be heard and registered.
Well, that was going to be my kind of next question as a segue to you as well. Actually, if so many people have lost faith in the system and more broadly, but also specifically in representative democracy and Congress and so forth, how do you put that? I mean, does America need something similar as far as constitutional convention? Would that never be?
I think there's no evidence of this at the moment, but the thing is that America is very decentralized. So I think that there could well be the situation where the progressives could start to capture the governorships and the state legislatures. And they are perfectly capable of constituting their own framework and structures of government. So in that sense, because of its very large and very inventive and very self-confident country, is it's not beyond the wit of the American left to develop forms like that. And they are over-obsessed with, for understandable reasons, but they're over-obsessed with the presidency. And I think one of the lessons that's happening now, or beginning to happen now, is that there was a trauma of having put their faith in Obama, and who looked and appeared to be transformative and became transactional and backed Wall Street. And one of this sense that there is now a much greater movement on the American left, and they're running in primaries, they're running against the older AOC became, captured a safe Democratic seat in New York because she ran against a figure who was a conservative Democrat, and everybody thought, was very shocked that actually, she could take the pavements and understood social media. And so I think that sense of that the left is beginning to be creative and inventive is certainly the case. But at the same time, they're very disheartened by and frustrated by the Biden presidency's sort of opening things up to them at the beginning and then backing off and being trapped into a kind of bipartisan rhetoric.
Yes, I mean, I suppose that leads actually really nicely to one thing I wanted to ask you, which is kind of about the center, in the sense of the center. I mean, I think the whole kind of way of talking about left, right, and center is probably a little bit something we need to leave behind. There are things we mean when we talk about the left that are kind of really important.
Very one-dimensional.
It's very one-dimensional, exactly. But as far as the center, I mean, like I was saying to you earlier, my kind of relationship to the center, at least, is one of bemusement and distrust. and one a sense of kind of being continually betrayed. If you think about the centre in the UK, kind of basically betraying Jeremy Corbyn, saying actually we'd rather have, well, even though we're totally like second referendum, everything, we'd still rather have Brexit than have Jeremy Corbyn. You see kind of these kind of US centrists who sort of are very carefully choosing their words, or, you know, which is at best, and at worst are, you know, people like Manchin and Sinema who are actually holding up the whole show. Do you think, I mean, especially given that the US has a sort of two-party system, can there ever be sort of peace there? Can that become a singular movement that's kind of functional enough to work, to hold water?
There are different things here. Let's put Corbyn on one side for the moment, talk about what's going on.
Yes, I'm sorry, we're jumping all over the world.
I think it's really important at this point, which I was trying to make at the beginning, that the centre is bipartisan in the true sense. So in which the leading figures of both parties are basically joined in a same singular project, which disarms and fatalizes the population and supports marketization.
People who are happy with the system,
and what is
not
happening now is that has been broken on the right. That the right said, you know, if there's so much discontent, it's so dangerous, and our own forms of making money, often illegal, you know, the kind of business, the business class, the property rentier, speculative frame of very, very wealthy, that section of American capitalism, they decided to go down the populist route, the authoritarian route, tearing up the rule book, if you like. And that has broken the spell, the intrinsic spell of the center, and it's forcing, so one of the if I could put it this way, sorry to say we're around to an argument in the book, when do revolutionary situations occur? The model we have in our head is only when the oppressed rise up, all of our numbers, and then we overthrow the ruling class, you know, who are trying to oppress us, but because, you know, they're failing or whatever it is, that we win by that way. No, this doesn't happen. That's not the revolutions of big changes happen when the ruling elite framework divides. When they are divided, there is an opening. When they are united, however bad their government and however good our opposition, we are going to be locked out. But when they divide, a new dynamic opens up. And the ruling elite within the United States, one very considerable part of it, and their children, are pro-environmentalism, right? They can see a climate crisis. They want good government. They want to be a multiracial democracy. And there's a very big division has opened up. And that has then been provoked, if you like, by the recklessness of Trump. And so what then happens is that you can put it this way, in a very interesting book, I think, on the 1688 revolution in the United Kingdom, in Britain. It wasn't then United Kingdom. The so-called Glorious Revolution is that by Pinker, and he argues that when the old regime cannot be secured, and when the ruling elite confronts two different ways of resolving that, that's when you have revolutionary situations. You have a situation of change when to take a counterexample, there was a great crisis in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. It became apparently, supposedly, you know, the trade union power was mounting. There was enormous problems with inflation, and there was a division within the British elite between going down the European route and going down what became the monetarist route, the Thatcherist route. And as the Thatcherite route was supported by Reagan in the United States, the ruling elite as a whole in the United Kingdom accepted that was the way forward. So they unified around that course of action, and then drove out the old trade union, broke the trade union left. So and within that, however much, you know, the GLC represented a very creative alternative, and it was simply pulverized. But what's happening now is that if you like, the Civil War in the United States which has never really ended, now has to be resolved. That the Trumpite recklessness, if you like, and the deep demographic changes and the demands of the environmental and the need to compete with China in terms of organizing and returning government means you can no longer say government is the problem. You've got to have active government. If you've got to have active government, you have to have one or another form of democratic legitimacy. Trump represents one solution to that, and the other solution cannot be going back to how it was.
No.
So
no.
we're now in a situation where we can say, well, look, obviously we understand there is a left-wing direction to the alternative solution, and a persuasion job has to take place within the center, within the elite, to say, yeah, okay, however reluctantly. So they're more repulsed, if you like, by the alternative, but then they're not looking forward in the way that we might be looking forward. But there has to be that alliance between the center and the left. And there has to be that if we're going to save the planet.
Oh, absolutely. But then, I mean, I hate to sound sort of, pessimistic. When I see the antics of Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and the kind of what I would call the American kind of centrist Democrat sort of, establishment, I don't feel much hope that that's possible. Do you see a way that can kind of can happen?
Put it like this. I think that if there were the 2020 election, let's step back one. These are two key figures in the Senate. The Senate is divided 50-50. To get any vote through the Senate, the Democratic Party has to be completely unified. These two figures are Democratic as nominally Democrats. They're not really centrist figures. They're very right-wing. Manchin's a very wealthy coal miner from an extremely reactionary part of the United States. Right. So what that means is that technically the Democrats did not win the legislature in the 2020 elections. That 50-50 meant that all power to decide a vote or not resided on these two, one very eccentric Sinema and one determinedly traditional right-wing Democrat of dyed-in-the-wool variety. And both of them now massively funded by corporate and Republican funding, given the role that they've taken. But two factors. The Democratic senators as a whole represent 40 million more people in the United States than the Republicans. So that is that's a measure of how rigged the American political system is. The Republicans are way overrepresented in sheer democratic terms. That means that the weight, the democratic force behind, if you like, a more intelligent, not a socialist democratic policy, but a more intelligent, creative one, is very considerable. And legitimacy, the larger legitimacy, lies with what is now the center of the Democratic Party, which wants to, do something about healthcare and have childcare and have basic social policies. Now, if in the Senate seats in the midterms or in the 2024 election, the Democrats were to win a majority of 5 or 6 in the Senate, would they put the policies through that Manchin and Sinema are opposing? Will they find and will they buy? Will American capital be able to buy another 5 Democratic senators and flip them? I think it's very unlikely. I think that what we're seeing is that programmatically, the Democrats have shifted decisively, and that there is a real difference between neo-fascist choice if you vote for the Trumpites and a progressive outcome if you vote Democrat. And that party division is completely different from the kind of bipartisan, politics that we have seen about, and it's very difficult for us to accept. Oh my goodness me, what is happening here? It's so deeply now ingrained in us that this choice cannot be made available. That even the possibility of it, people are sort of scornful of. And of course, here it is that this is exactly what and this is why I think Starmerism is doomed. Starmer, instead of building on the beginnings of making that polarization under Corbyn, who I think completely mishandled it personally, so that's another conversation perhaps, has gone into reverse. He is trying to go back to the period of actually minimizing the difference between the core project. He's basically saying, I'm a better conservative than the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and that's just a policy that never really worked. And
that will demobilize and demoralize people. He's not even getting angry about the fact that they put through voter ID. He's not getting angry about he's not pledging, I'm going to reverse this in the first week we get in. I'm going to say, I'm going to reverse the police legislation. I'm going to restore the independence of the Electoral Commission. I mean, there's no sense in which he's actually really represents what we might call an opposition to what is going on.
No, it's quite unbelievable.
Yes, but one of the things that's interesting here, if you like, is that everybody thinks, well, this is hopeless. I mean, it's not. And so I don't think he's. I think we're sort of we're just facing the like the caving in of the British political system. The image I have for here, so we can get back to where it's more into America, is that. In a supernova, a star, this great star, emits an enormous pulse of energy and then collapses into a black hole. And I see Brexit as an enormous pulse of democratic protest that lit up the political universe around the world. And we went, whoa, what's going on? And now the great British star is collapsing into a black hole. And we're caught in this negative, black, dark gravity. There's nothing we can do about it. Everybody is trapped in this process, and there has to be a break from this process going on. I think that the most obvious one is for Scotland to become independent, for our calling time on the United Kingdom as a separate entity, and all joining the European Union: England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. And at that point, England can become a vigorous and normal country. But we're a long way from any significant political force being able to sort of break with the great British tradition. And certainly Starmer's not doing that. So we're in.
But how much worse do things have to get here before we can sort of find a way out of this?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It can go on and on.
In a way, that's the question of our time, isn't it? How much worse do things have to get?
But it may be the case that, if you take one of the things which is shifting things is what's going on with the Ukraine, and it's very striking that the Ukraine, which Johnson is trying to run the Ukraine as the Falklands War, to become a war leader and to bask in that popularity, but he's not taking the risks. Thatcher gained from the Falklands War because of the extreme personal risk that she took, which is Johnson's clearly not. The Ukraine is fighting to join the European Union, right? I mean, the first European leader to get to Kyiv was not Boris Johnson. No, it was the leader of the European Commission, and they have now signed the process. They've actually, under the conditions of war, they have initiated the full process of application. So the European Union will change. I mean, I think Ukraine is going to win, and when it does, they will join the European Union. That will completely change the nature of the European Union, psychologically and mentally, and numerically. Numerically means that Poland and the Ukraine together have the same population as Germany. So it will shift the nature of the European Union, how people see it and experience it. And
the politics of Poland, that's a very dark corner.
But they're also for democracy. Quite obviously they are. This is a democratic process, and for government. So this is going to shift things, and that suddenly, you may suddenly find the point that people turn around and they say, "What is all this Brexit stuff about?" You know, we were sold Brexit as being, you know, that the European Union was the past. It was old and it was sort of, you know, confining, and it wasn't a continent of freedom, and we will gain our freedom and become a, you know, world significant. And this is, you know, suddenly that will, everybody will think, hold on a second, you know, where so the larger truth, the larger demystification of what Brexit was about will, one way or another, will be revealed.
But doesn't it kind of exist on rather identitarian contours? I mean, it's very hard. What you were saying earlier when we were sort of refuting the idea that this is bare deceit. I mean, if it were, then you could clear it up with truth, right? But it doesn't work that way, because ultimately Brexit, or, you know, which party you vote for in pretty much most countries, I think, it's a question of actually who you consider yourself to be. There's really interesting research now that when you feed people the truth, they don't change their mind. In fact, they become more inventive about how they will distort that, the information they have to support their existing sense of who they are, who their community is. And so, I mean, you know, that's obviously was true in relation to the European Union, but I'm thinking back to what you were saying about, you know, in the US, how, you know, if this happens in the midterms and we can do, you know, and the 40 million extra that we have, or that the Democrats represent, how do we actually, I mean, how does that even matter? How can we, if the system is kind of against you and the people's sense of who they are is kind of against you, don't you have to wait for the kind of intergenerational conflicts and identitarian concepts to sort of float away, or for the system to change?
The majority, the point in the United States is that the majority is not against us. The majority is not unilateral. I mean, as I said, on the abortion issue, on Roe versus Wade, the majority is overwhelmingly in favor of.
The system is, as far as like the way that, you know,
the system is not a dictatorship in America, and Trump, of course, wishes to lock the system, the rigged system, into a permanent exclusion of the larger democratic forces. So the threat of Trumpism is precisely that. It will then be irreversible. I think the thing, if I could put it this way, that what the assault on the Capitol was saying, I no longer accept the rules, right? Whatever the election result, I am going to organize a coup, and he nearly did organize a coup. And there was a very clear, one of the interviews I've done with Jamie is with Representative Jamie Raskin, who led the process of impeachment against Trump, the second impeachment trial. He led it. He's both a lawyer and a member of Congress. And he spells out the way in which they were trying to get Pence out of Congress to stop the Electoral College, and then what would have then have happened that would have ensured that Trump could then have retained the presidency. But while they were playing this, so to speak, within a narrow sense of the rules, they were clearly trying to shatter what were the accepted conventions of the Constitution and the process of changing power. And they defied, if you like, one of the core aspects of the entire constitutional framework that the United States set out, which was that accepting the peaceful transfer of power. Accepting that you do lose, but by losing, you also preserve your position and can win next time. Now, they broke that. And what's significant is when they broke that, the Republican Party, instead of saying we remain loyal to the core framework of the historic American Constitution, the Republican Party as a whole, its supporters, its voters, and its administrators and the governors of 27, a majority of the American states, said, right, we're going to take this country over by foul means. We're no longer going to play by these rules. So that while we see the system as rigged, they seem to see the system as not sufficiently rigged. They wish to break the system to ensure it becomes effectively a system of dictatorship. And if now Trump or a Trump supporter were to win in 2024, it would not be a repeat of the Trump presidency. It would be a really, they would then immediately put their people in charge of the army, in terms of the police, in terms of the, in particular, of the intelligence services. And the American intelligence services, they track everybody. They will know, but
with the help of the British intelligence services, right?
Yeah. So, but the thing is that that you would then have a surveillance state of a kind which would certainly be equal to what the Chinese are doing. You would have, and that surveillance, you would then have a surveillance dictatorship of American capitalism, and I do think that then it would just burn the planet. So that's the danger that it represents. It's a very serious one, and I don't think it's been really understood. People think, return of Trump or a Trump supporter in 24 is not going to rerun the Trump presidency of 2016. It's going to be, this Trump, such a presidency will not allow itself. That's what it's saying, to be ejected by a fair vote. I mean, Biden got a 7 million plurality. He wasn't, he won very narrowly in terms of the Electoral College. And they're going to say, we don't accept that this is, effectively they're going to overrule democracy. But the other side of that means, hey, we're on a knife edge. But this knife edge means that we're equal to, in different ways, we're in there. This is a contest between equal powers, not here in the United States, but in the UK, but in the United States. And what I try to do in the book is say, well, that's very surprising. Where did this come from? The left historically has been here. This is not a socialist opposition to Trump, but where does this come from? What are the forces which mean that there is a 7 million majority for Biden? What are the forces which mean that there is this very big progressive movement in the United States? What are the forces which mean that we can stop Trumpism? Well, if this is, if the left has been crushed and if their system is rigged. And that's where I look at the sort of what I call the forces of humanization. Feminism is particularly important, far more effective than the Russian Revolution. The feminism, the Black Lives Matter, the anti-racism, the environmental movement, which has given people a way of understanding the totality of what is going on and the interconnectedness in a far more effective and practical fashion than socialist theory. If you look at the way in which our bodies have been our sense of ourselves, and the whole framework, although human rights was developed as in a legal way to, if you like, reinforce depoliticization, it also empowered our sense of ourselves and who we are, and the sense that we have a claim which we can make independent of what's going on in terms of the political system. And then the scientific advances of the last 50 years in terms of how we understand ourselves and understand each other and understand the pathologies that marketization creates in us. And then digitization, which is another crucial because it makes participation possible. It makes our capacity to have our voices heard and to be considered is transformative. And these forces, which I call forces, they have not yet generated. We haven't yet generated an articulate politics. And in the United States, they don't really have a clear story of what America is in the way that Trump represents a very sort of powerful, crude narrative with which people can identify. But the potential of doing so is there. And these are the sort of sense, we're losing, the sort of, after losing for 30 years, it would say, well, you're just trying to cheer us up. But no, I think that this is a great battle, and we need to understand our own strengths and not try to look at it from the traditional leftist way, which is a hopeless, narrow, fashion of trying to redefine everything in terms of what happened at the end of the 19th century, or put it into sort of classic socialist Marxist terms. And we've got to re-understand what it means, what humanization means. And we look at what happened with Black Lives Matter when Floyd was, murdered. I mean, we visibly saw what the indifference. The shocking thing was the way Chauvin looked at the people that were being protesting about it, who were saying, he's not breathing, he's dying. And then look at him completely, what are you worrying about? And that, if this is not us, and it was sort of white, wasn't just a black protest, that was really important. It was a multiracial, we cannot accept that this is what we are like. We're not going to accept. And I think the same reaction has occurred with the Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. The cynicism and the indifference, the look on Putin's face and the look on Chauvin's face are rather similar, kind of rather sort of podgy, indifferent and brutal. And we're saying, no, this is not going to be the future of humanity. We just do not accept that. And this is both is elemental, but it's also modern. And it's also come about in a way which hasn't come before. This is if you come at it from a leftist or socialist point of view, you say, well, they people are not sort of they're not seeing the international, he's not really left wing. No, actually, it's a real challenge to the hegemony of capitalism as we know it. And this is something which we have got to build and understand and work with and deepen our own understanding of and learn from.
Do you think that, because I really like that bit of your book where you kind of list these kind of 7 humanizing factors. I hope this isn't a provocative question, but I wonder, are there any more that you would like to add? Obviously, the most frustrating thing about writing a book is that after it's done, you can't edit it anymore. Would there be an 8th now? With Ukraine, would you add, for example, a sort of anti-war, more explicit anti-war thing there as well? Or are there any others that you might add?
Yes, well, I think the question, I do say 2 or 3 times, I put it in brackets, there may be more.
That's why I wondered about, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't feel that I fully understand the extent and the range of what they are. And I think there is a kind of an anti-capitalist element to it, which I didn't really want to sort of try to work through, because I was looking at what was more novel. And what I mean by that is that we now live in a kind of rentier system where people, you might read that so-and-so's made £100 million or made some enormous billions, and you think this person probably don't even know how to sharpen a pencil. They haven't made anything.
Well,
And yet they have, quote, made money. And I think there's a sort of repulsion about that. They haven't earned something. So I think there's partly a difference here, because there's a very big section of American capitalism which is backing or has a relationship which is anti-Trump, and which is involved in whether it's Apple or whatever it may be, that there is a relationship to their manufacturers. They make something. They make good products. They're proud of the fact that their products are good, because they're making money as well on the stock exchange. But they're not driven by financial speculation, and they're not rentier. They're not making money out of rentier. And I would even include, in a certain way, although is anti-unionism and failure to pay tax repulsive, Amazon have transformed. They've really done something. They've made. They've created markets, and you're forced to buy things from Amazon in part because they're very effective and they make things available that you couldn't get other ways. So there's and they're not. So I think there is a kind of there may well be an aspect of this the humanization, which is an instinctive repulsion from the corrupt and the parasitic, and the sense of those who Biden used this phrase about in a very boring, I thought very dull and dangerously politically dull State of the Union address suddenly denounced Russian oligarchs and said that they would expropriate their ill-begotten gains. So slightly
thin ice there, I think.
It was suddenly said, and you suddenly felt, hundreds of people in Congress sitting back. They didn't stand up and applaud. How much of the funding has come from ill-begotten gains?
Yeah, most of them are millionaires themselves as well.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there may be other forces of humanization. So I put this forward not as this is what's happening, but an attempt to explore the ways in which we are claiming ourselves. And I think one important thing I would just emphasize for those who haven't read the book or thought about this, that one of the aspects of consumerism is that it is telling us that we have the power to choose, that we should look after our bodies and our health, and that it's stimulating our sense of self-government. It's stimulating our sense of agency, and at the same time commercializing it, limiting it, manipulating it. And we don't like that, but we like the sense of agency that it is offering.
Yes.
And we need to politicize that sense of agency in the sense that, this is a book which is in favor of politics, real politics. More politics we have, the better. The more people we elect, the better. The more processes of considering how we work with each other, the better. And but it's rooted in, it's oddly so, capitalism itself, consumer capitalism itself, has generated a sense of creativity, even while it is trying to crush that creativity taking control of capitalism.
So does that mean, because I was interested, for example, in your film, which hopefully, everyone will see in a few days' time, but Ro, for example.
You've seen a rough cut, yes.
Ro in his interview is very careful not to condemn capitalism in explicit terms, whereas if you hear Bernie Sanders or AOC, they kind of, even they sound quite careful sometimes. Can the future that we're trying to build, is it one that works with and tries to redeem capitalism, or tries to have conversations about why it's bad, or just tries to kind of repudiate it altogether?
This is a really interesting question. It's one I'm very interested in. So it just explained to the viewers and listeners. Ro Khanna is the Democratic representative of the district in California, which includes Silicon Valley. And the market value of the companies in his district is $11 trillion. And he calls himself a progressive capitalist. And he discusses that he's been very influenced by Amartya Sen. He's written an interesting book called Dignity in the Digital Age, about the need for an internet bill of rights, with an introduction from Amartya Sen. And at the same time, he was the co-chair of the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and he is working with the American trade unions. So this is a very, we don't have, this is a very surprising kind of political figure, very articulate, and quite new and original, and also taking the digital world very seriously. And here, in America, what point I was trying to make is they really do have a capitalism. They really do make things. There are,
and
really
they love it. It is very kind of.
There aren't anymore, and whatever it is, your water is owned by the speculators, and the trains are owned by the Germans and the French, and the newspapers are owned by the foreigner. That sort of P&O is being sold off to Dubai. So there isn't a sense of we might sneer at the idea of in England of progressive capitalism, but England has sold off its capitalism. And my feeling here is this: what I argue in the book is let's roll. If you want to replace capitalism, if you sit back and say, I am a socialist, I'm going to replace, I know what is, right? Then there are only two choices available. One is one or another form of Leninism. It's a way of saying it will break down, and we, through whether it's equivalent of a Corbyn, or we will take power, we will get hold of the state, and then we will make reverse the domination of capitalism. And in the end, eventually, the population will understand that we're on the side of history. And the other course is to say only when there is a majority of the population, a clear, decisive majority of the population wanting to say we've got to move on from capitalism, can we move on from capitalism? The only route to the replacement of capitalism is through democracy. And you have to decide, there's a choice there. Which do you take?
But I mean, isn't that like trying to convince, a highly religious state to leave behind their kind of very sort of closely held values? I mean, it's, I sort of think to the narrative of the self-made entrepreneur, the person who got rich on cryptocurrency, the startup founder, Trump used to talk a lot about, I love small businesses, I love restaurants. There's this sense of like creating wealth is kind of sacred. I can't really see America kind of, obviously people know that the American dream is dead. That's part of what the frustration is about. And yet at the same time, they remain enamored of this idea that kind of, building up wealth and creating something for yourself by this, sweat of your brow is kind of more, there's nothing holier than that. I mean, how can you get a country of that size to move past those kinds of beliefs?
Well, the thing is, I don't think it should move past them in as complete a way as you assume I would think, because I think that, I've started Open Democracy. And in order to start Open Democracy, I registered a company. Registered a company, and then that gave us certain rules and obligations, and the demand that we register audited accounts in Companies House, and of course all sorts of ways in which the larger speculative companies try to get around that. But the idea that you can do that you could set up a publishing company if you want to publish your books. That this is a creative thing to do, that if you want to create a shop, if you want to sell something, you can do that, and that you are actually, it's not the only form of creativity isn't sort of writing books or making paintings or music. I mean, that there are all sorts of ways in which you can express yourself economically. I think that's right. I think that is a part of human activity, and I don't think that there is one of the points that Kahneman makes, which is taken from Amartya Sen, is that the collective, the single will of the larger economy is not. We also have lives to have within that, and we wish to be able to resist that, and we want. And those forms of freedom are something which I don't think that those existed. Markets existed before capitalism.
Sure.
There's no reason why markets would exist. They didn't exist under communism. They didn't exist under the communism that we've known. So I think that I look at in the end of the book, how people now are rather, especially young people, are very pro-socialist, but without really being clear what it means. They know it's something which is social. They know it's not in favor of the kind of capitalism we've got at the moment, but they're not against enterprise. They're not against freedom. No. And so I think that represents a very creative possibility. I don't think that's something which we should sort of sneer at or think this. The question of the domination of finance capital, the question of whether companies are only measured by the profit and not by the quality of what they make. The insistence on saying that no, any company that exists has got to take into account its impact on the environment, has got to become social. The moving away from saying that maximization of profit is the aim of production. That we have to do. That we have to do. And whether that produces, whether the idea of progressive capitalism is a complete contradiction in terms, then or not, that's something that we have, the population as a whole, we have to learn as societies, and then we have to be able to make that call democratically. That's what I'm saying. And if okay, let's take democracy fully as far as we can, and then let's see what happens. But so in that sense, my politics is a Republican politics rather than a socialist politics.
I think we're kind of starting to run out of time a little bit. So rather than continue with the other questions that I had, much as I really want to ask them, but perhaps I can ask you them privately at some point. We do have one question from our attendees, which I'd like to put to you, and then we can see if there are any others, and then we can wrap because time's getting low. This question from somebody named Anonymous Attendee is, what do you think about the influence of billionaire or mega donors and their influence on elections in funding candidates and on other political causes?
Well, this influence exists, and I'm against it. I'm against the influence of corporate money on politics, especially dark corporate money, which you can't identify. It's very corrupting in this country, and it's absolutely systemic in the United States. So one of the things that's very interesting about what's happening in America now, and also now happening here, is the extent to which corruption is being called out, and Trump, paradoxically, although he is probably the most corrupt politician there has been in American history, as he made his money out of money laundering. Kind of said, there was this thing when he got elected, he said, the system is fixed and I should know because I've been part of the system. I'm therefore the only
That was
person
astonishing, wasn't it?
And so, okay, fine, give it a try. But partly when people said that, because it was so frustrated, by the way in which, Hillary Clinton, the Clintons have made $150 million out of since leaving the presidency, and they just felt, well, they were in hock to the system and not being honest and not even admitting that they were. And I think one of the things that's happened now is that the sense of dark money is everybody's aware of it, and it's one of the other interesting things. This conversation, which I quote, because the legislation was being put by the Democrats, which hasn't gone through, of exposing and limiting the role of money in politics. And it is incredibly popular, including with Republicans. Republican voters overwhelmingly dislike the idea that their parties are being bought. They dislike the idea that politics is bought. They don't like the way in which the system is gerrymandered. And it's a sign of the influence of corporate money on the Democrats that this hasn't really been much stronger within sort of democratic politics. And of course, the media itself is also, it's a point which is made in the film by David Sirota, who runs this website called The Lever, that the coverage of politics by the media is by a corporate media that itself doesn't regard the role of money in politics as, quote, a story. Regards it as normal. But one of the very positive things the most is the repulsion of the voters. There's no democratic support for the way in which corporate power is exercised, and a progressive politics that can bring to bear the democratic legitimacy of opposition to it. We can drive a lot of the influence of corporate power out of politics.
I mean, if we had more time, I'd like to ask kind of how we go about that, because it seems there's an imbalance between what we say has democratic support or doesn't have democratic support, and the difficulty with which we can actually, introduce or withdraw those things from American political life. I mean, there's in the Michael Moore film that came out about 4 years ago about American politics, there's this very powerful moment where he says, actually, he asked the question, when did the US stop being a left-wing country? And then he says it never did. Actually, all of these progressive policies have majority support. Getting money out of politics is one of them. Universal healthcare is one of them. As you say, supporting women's right to abortion is one of them. And yet it seems impossible to do anything about any of these, or there's a lot of other obstacles there.
Both parties with corporate influence behind both parties, a click, right? So that your lobbies, your great companies are paying money to the Republicans and money to the Democrats, and they're fixing it so that there is an agreement around this. And the point, and I'm saying I accept this is true, and I accept it, and I accept that we are powerless until the click unclunks and unclicks. And if one side is facing, the Trumpism and racism and authoritarianism and a climate catastrophe and subordination to China, etc., that's how they see one side. Then they're saying, well, actually, we no longer play the same game. They're no longer playing the same game with each other, and that has generated the opening. And this is a crucial part of the argument. It's not like, oh, well, can we win now? Is it just up? It's not just simply a matter of our force. We have to have a sense of what is the totality of the forces at work. They're very dangerous, very, very dangerous. I've never known a situation so dangerous in my lifetime. But at the same time, these powerful historic forces, which perhaps have always been there, now are becoming articulated and outspoken, and we need to build on that. We have the possibility within the United States, within Chile, not within the United Kingdom. There is a possibility of winning.
Yes, which leads me to the last question that I'll ask you, and then we can wrap. And it's a question I was asked a lot when my book came out. It's a very hard question, I think, but it's kind of goes with the territory of writing about these kinds of things. Anthony, what can we do to bring that about? What are the moves that need to be played? Right. Well,
we being
we basically see
here we are in Houseman's, which is a London bookshop. What we should do in London.
I mean it in a more cosmopolitan sense, to be honest with you. We, as in those of us on the right side of this.
Let's start with what should we do in London? What we should be doing in London is everybody who is a citizen, born in England, should be demanding independence for Scotland. We've got to put an end to the great British narrative. This is the only way of our returning to our continent. I'm not starry-eyed about the European Union. The European Union represents the terrain of reality, and that's where our battles have to be fought, with other Europeans in the European context. And there's no way out of this. There's no way of saying, oh, well, it was a decision that's been taken. Of course, democratic decisions can be mistaken. Is the fundamental right, human right, to make a mistake. And the English voters, England without London, made a very big historic mistake. But still, it was a bold decision. They were misled. They've made a mistake. You can make a mistake, dust yourself down and start again. We've got to be able to say that, and we've got to be clear that that's what we need to do, and not feel all hunched and we've got to make a success of Brexit, and we don't want the Scots to leave because we don't want to be left with the English, and all that kind of that defeatism. Is there any chance of this happening soon? No, but if you ask me, that's what we should be doing. Then that's what I'm saying, and I know people really all shake their head and say no, but that's that. And the younger and the more spirited you are, and let's become a normal country. And so we're in a trap within the larger progressive. What should we be doing? Well, I think what we do need to see is that there is a worldwide fight against authoritarianism, whether it's in the form of Putin or in the form of Xi or in the form of Modi or form of Bolsonaro. And if this means allying with a Biden administration, which we can't really trust, but which in terms of that battle is one that we have to fight with them, then that's what we have to do. Because the alternative is catastrophic. And what we have to emphasize is that this alliance has to see the climate emergency as an absolute priority. It has to be absolutely principled about racial justice. And it has to be clear that we are going to end corruption and dark money. And that's the first stage of doing something about rentier capitalism and developing, a more egalitarian politics and policies.
That's a good answer. I mean, we could go on and on, Anthony, but thank you so much.
And I haven't talked about the media there. I'm sorry, we haven't talked about sort of situation of lies, and obviously we need a media that can, so I agree that this is one of the great impediments to our doing this. But I think that the elements of a progressive, beginnings of a progressive policy are there, and the need to be sophisticated about how we develop democracy, not being naive, I'm not being falling back on the traditional structures, but there's lots to do, and I think this is a very, very good time to be young.
Well, that's a nice optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much for all of your for your book. First of all, everyone should buy this. It's fantastic, and it's the best 13 quid you will spend. Thank you very much for your answers and your time, and it's been a great pleasure to do this with you. Thanks to Houseman as well.
Pushing the argument.
Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. We have both of your books. We have all of your books, in fact, in stock at the shop at the moment. So if anyone wants to come and visit us in King's Cross to pick them up, we are open as usual, and we'll have more events coming up online in the next few weeks. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a nice evening.
Bye.